To be honest, finally released the book, and we also know now the secret behind 3 R's. And here we go, and release the book, Politics of the Global Economic Crisis, Regulation, Responsibility, and Radicalism. Ladies and gentlemen, please put your hands together. And I also request Dr. Tharoor to release the faculty publications of O.P. Jindal Global University on this occasion. This is the faculty publications from year 2009 to 2013. Yes, put your hands together. Now I request Dr. Tharoor to share his thoughts with us. I'm sure he has lost his breath.
Vice Chancellor Radkumar, Mr. Delaser, Sreeram Chaulia, very distinguished members of the audience, Jindal University students, ladies and gentlemen, friends. I hope that covers everyone. It really is a pleasure. I know it's customary to begin by saying that, but it is to introduce, to release today, Politics of the Global Economic Crisis, Regulation, Responsibility, and Radicalism, the second of Sreeram Chaulia's books that I'm releasing in an astonishingly short time. There's a lot that brings me to this podium with these two gentlemen, both of whom I first encountered when they were students. Rajkumar was in my audience when I spoke at Harvard. I think he was he'd come freshly from being a Rhodes Scholar in Oxford and studying at Harvard. And he came up to me, and I must say that I was impressed by this young man, and I stayed connected to him for whatever, 17 years, something like that, since we first met. And I wouldn't go so far as to be pretentious enough to call him a protege, but he's somebody I've encouraged at various steps of the way, including on his persistence and creativity and really doggedness in setting up and becoming the first Vice Chancellor, the youngest Vice Chancellor in India of the O.P. Jindal University. So in many ways, Rajkumar is somebody whose career I've not only been proud of having encouraged, but in many ways I feel inspired by, because it shows me the kind of thing that is possible in the new India that would not have been possible when people like Boromir Wathakuda, my spot sitting in the back, and I were his age. I think there was certainly a narrower set of possibilities. Someone like Raj coming in with his distinguished international background, his impatience to get new things done, being able to cut across many of the regulatory and other challenges to set up a university and to bring it to the kind of level of recognition that he already has is truly remarkable. And the problem with this is that I find it difficult to say no to you, which is why I've done far too many events for Rajkumar over the years. I'm going to have to somehow manage to find that word in my vocabulary at some point. But when he asked Sreeram, I couldn't say no either, because Sreeram too had first contacted me when he was a student and sent me a piece. I think you sent it to me, or maybe I came across it, that you had written, which I was very impressed by. And thereafter he kept in touch, went off abroad, wrote from abroad. One thing I will say about Sreeram is throughout his time as a graduate student, as a doctoral student, and then as a professor, he has always engaged in the public sphere. And I really welcome that. I have always believed that for intellectuals and scholars to simply write for themselves and for each other denies the broader thinking and reflective public the benefit of their research and reflection. And Sreeram is from the very beginning and consistently put his views out in the public space, in online publications initially, which were not initially that well known. The whole habit of online reading is relatively newly entrenched, but I think more than a decade ago you read it for Asia Online and places like that. And then, of course, as he's grown older, he's built up quite a collection of writing. He's now published in print as well in a number of our very well-known publications. And now in First Post, I think, which the Dheeraj has come and joined them there. So there's a lot happening in the media space, and I think it's important that scholars like Sreeram, who have a talent for putting across intelligent points of view that can be understood by non-scholars, but who are nonetheless interested in the subject, that people like them become public intellectuals in a meaningful sense. We have, frankly, been somewhat short of that category of people. I would still say that the vast majority of our op-ed pages and columns have been colonized by retired government officials and bureaucrats and diplomats. Not a bad thing, many of them are fine, but since very often the duty of a public intellectual is to challenge the established wisdom that has been perpetrated by people like that, for them to monopolize the op-ed pages can sometimes, I think, result in a poverty of discourse. So Ramchandra Guha, people like that, who have come in and managed to keep a foot in the academy, do some serious research and writing, and at the same time find time to engage in public space. I'm very glad to see the younger generation, Sreeram Chaulia, out there doing that. And so, politics of the global economic crisis is an interesting and important contribution to the discussion of these issues. It straddles, I think, the worlds of both scholarship and public policy advocacy, in that it is thoroughly researched. There's a very impressive bibliography at the end, which I think in many ways is almost state-of-the-art on the subject that he has covered. I don't think there's anything that he's left out and not read. And while that is true, so there is work, it is a work of scholarship. At the same time, he has included a lot of his pieces in the newspapers. Now, on that, Sreeram, I have a small difficulty in that I think that the one flaw in the book is that too many of these pieces simply appear as is. I would rather you took that material and wove it into an updated narrative than to simply plonk them there with a footnote saying, this article appeared in so-and-so publication, some and such date. Because I think you have a very interesting vision and a very coherent narrative, and it would have been better to recite. I'm a shameless reciter myself, but you will find that what I do is I rewrite or reweave things, and then at the end I have an acknowledgement saying that some of the material in this book has appeared in a different form in my columns in the Times Radio or whatever. And that I think is fair. And it's fair on the reader, and it's fair on the original readers and the publishers of the original piece, but it's also fair to today's readers to see that. But having said that, Sreeram has done an excellent job, a very impressive job of tackling an issue which we in India were mercifully largely spared from the worst effects of when it happened, though it's true that of late, sort of the tail of the global economic crisis has slapped us across the face. But the fact is that while it was happening, we could say with some justified complacency that for a number of reasons we had stayed out of it. Partly, of course, our conservative regulatory environment. I'm not a huge fan of this first R in Sreeram's book, because I've often argued that in our country, and I feel it very keenly in the area in which I'm now working at HRD, Human Resource Development, that in our country, we are often over-regulated and under-governed, by which I mean that we have an awful lot of regulations that lay down rules, restrictions, things that require permission, things that require no objection certificates, things that require various hoops to be gone through. But what is missing very often is the spirit within which the supervision of governance should be undertaken. And so often the regulation works at counter purposes with the intended spirit, and so, as I say, in general, I would argue that reducing our regulatory behavior is good for us economically, socially, and politically. But in this particular instance, the conservative regulatory atmosphere, the attitude of the Reserve Bank of India at the time, did mean that our banks were neither tempted nor able to allow themselves to get infected by all these toxic securities, these mortgage and credit default swaps and all this, which laid low so many of the banks in the Western world. And I think that that was an important factor. The second, of course, was that, particularly in those days, and only marginally less so now, our economy was much less dependent on external trade for its GDP growth. something like 75 to 80% of our GDP growth comes from Indians selling goods and services to other Indians. And that is important to recognize, because that's one of the reasons why when the Western economies began to contract as a result of the global economic crisis, we were less affected than we could otherwise have been. There was another factor which I certainly, as a Kerala politician, feel has not been given enough weightage in all the analyses of how India handled the global economic crisis. And that was a tremendous faith in India of Indians abroad. And I don't mean the fancy NRIs who are running foreign banks and companies and multinationals. They didn't show that much faith in India. But the blue-collar workers in the Gulf, 75% of them from my state of Kerala, they kept sending remittances back home for all of this. And even while FDI was dropping, our remittances were going up. And if you look at our remittances during the global economic crisis, I think 2008-9 was 55 billion, 2009-10 was 59 billion, 2010-11 was 60-something. The last year that I saw was $70 billion in remittances. The bulk of it from ordinary Indians working abroad who never stopped sending their resources back to our country and thereby helping in many ways shore up the numbers on our end. So all of these things helped us. But as a general proposition, I would agree that we were not a particularly major player in this issue, and that Sreeram's book, quite rightly, has very little space for India and Indian issues. It's a much broader and global view of what happened and how the politics played out. He has, as he himself has admitted, a somewhat left-of-centre perspective on the matter. But what's interesting is that when one looks at the whole thing, there was if you like, a left-of-centre global perspective in the macroeconomic sphere that emerged from this. Because one of the things the global economic crisis taught us all is that the traditional attitudes of the Bretton Woods institutions, the World Bank and the IMF in particular, that global economic management basically involves the rich countries supervising the economic delinquency of the poor countries. That notion was essentially laid to rest with the global economic crisis, when it became very apparent that the problem was neither caused by nor had anything to do with the developing countries, the poorer countries in the world. It was the economic mismanagement of the developed countries that had created this crisis. And in fact, the crisis directly led to the discussions of the G20 in Pittsburgh, which led to a concrete decision to push more of the voting percentages and the weightage in the Bretton Woods institutions away from the developed world and towards the developing and transition economies. Something which had been fought for many years without any success. But suddenly, by the time of Pittsburgh, it was no longer possible for the Western countries to pretend that they had a monopoly of macroeconomic virtue, and their resistance to the idea of balancing the scales between the West and the rest crumbled. I wouldn't say entirely crumbled, but certainly weakened. And we've already seen the beginnings of the shift. I mean, it's starting to realize that 3 years ago, Belgium had greater weighting power in the weighted voting power in the Bretton Woods institutions than China did. And that was the way in which these institutions were set up at the end of the Second World War. And the global economic crisis may have been the proximate cause for the beginning of a historic shift in this kind of authority, and that I think is worth bearing in mind. In his conclusion, in his epilogue, Sreeram says, and I quote, that while developing countries have their own, or the emerging economies as he calls them, he doesn't use the word developing countries much, have their own slow crisis of rampant and rising inequalities, lack of social safety nets for workers, grinding poverty, and state systems that have abandoned the bulk of society and embraced highly corrupted forms of capitalism. Very harsh language, not all of which is justified by the foregoing, but he says it. He says that nonetheless it is important that states have a greater role in economies, and he goes on to say the radicalism that will be needed in the coming decades in the global south has to, and I'm paraphrasing now, strengthen the capacity of the states and hold them to the obligations to social justice. This is an important argument. I think, in all fairness, that Sreeram could have developed it somewhat more, because the epilogue is written really at op-ed length and not at scholarly chapter length to push that point. But he has indeed, it seems to me, made throughout the book a powerful case for the inadequacies, limitations, and injustices of an economics of corporate entrepreneurship and individualism alone. And he makes the point, and this is worth quoting again in his words, society is not the same as the economy, and the former cannot be yoked to the latter. I think that is an extremely important thing. And again, in my job in MHRD, I often find myself saying we need to create a knowledge society and not just a knowledge economy, which we may be on the road to creating. And I think it's a similar insight that we see here in Sreeram's thing when he says that that you can't yoke the two, that they actually are distinct. And then he goes on to add, we need to return to a politics where both the economy and the state are embedded in and are responsible to society. Now that, I think, is an extremely important insight, but I'm not content seeing it as one sentence in the last paragraph of his book. I'd like you to develop on that, perhaps in another article, which will be appended to the second edition of this volume. But I think it's an important insight, and it may represent a very important intellectual contribution to the future direction of the discussion of this. The book is compelling. It has, as I said, a lot of material that was written at the time and has the freshness and immediacy of it, though I would have liked to see it more up to date or more woven into a continuing narrative. But the kernel of some very important ideas can be found in this book, and I want to congratulate the author, Sreeram Chaulia, for having first of all, having written so much, secondly, for having put it together, and I want to congratulate the publishers for having done justice to this very serious volume. It's important that books like this be available to student readers, to journalists. I'm so pleased that journalists and op-ed writers are present here who will take some of this forward, some of these ideas, and provide a platform for intelligent discussion of these ideas. And finally, to Rajkumar and O.P. Jindal University for having given a scholar on their faculty who, apart from his teaching, also has administrative responsibilities, for having given somebody like that the time and the space and the intellectual freedom to become an important public intellectual contributing to the nation's discourse on issues we simply don't spend enough time thinking about. So once again, congratulations to all of you on the podium. All the best for your success and the success of the book. Thank you, namaskar, and jai.